In January 2017, the sole heir to the Samsung empire was arrested of bribery, embezzlement, and perjury by the South Korean prosecutor's office. According to sources, Lee was accused of transferring $37 million to two nonprofit organizations run by a close associate of South Korea's former president, in exchange for political support, which included backing for a contentious Samsung merger that cleared the way for Lee to become the conglomerate's ultimate CEO. A saga that resulted in the impeachment of a South Korean president and sparked public outrage about the country's close ties with corporations. Lee Jae-yong is not the first member of his family to see the inside of a prison. His father, Lee Kun-hee, was arrested and charged for paying bribes to then-President Roh Tae-woo in 1996. The president that followed, Kim Young-sam, controversially pardoned him for his crime. 12 years later, Korean police raided Lee's home and office in an ongoing probe into accusations that Samsung was responsible for a slush fund used to bribe influential prosecutors, judges, and political figures in South Korea. In 2014, however, Lee Kun-hee, Samsung's 75-year-old chairman, had a heart attack that put his son, Lee Jae-yong, at the helm of a sprawling business empire that encompasses gadgets, appliances, engineering, construction, shipbuilding, insurance, and credit cards. At a time when the pandemic and U.S.-China tensions were escalating, Lee's detention had left a void at the head of the world's largest maker of memory chips, cell phones, and consumer appliances. You see, in South Korea, Samsung has become one of the most hated monopolies in the country. Alongside other brands you might know, like Hyundai and LG, these companies are seen as companies which are above the law and basically control the government. They have been embroiled in many controversies involving corruption and economic manipulation. They have come to be known as Chaebols, a word that comes from the combination of the characters for rich and clan. It applies to large groups of interconnected companies that are usually dominated by a wealthy family. In this video, we will tell you about how Chaebols rose to power and how they influence the world today. We will also talk about some of the controversies that have plagued these companies through the years. Welcome to another project. In 1953, the national GDP per capita of South Korea was just $67. In the same year, the unadjusted United States GDP per capita was $2,400. The country was in extreme poverty after the political turmoil that followed the Japanese occupation and the Korean War. North Korea posed a serious threat. Spying on both sides of the aisle was prevalent, and the South Korean government at the time was either incapable or unwilling to assist its people in their recovery. Then there was General Park Chung-hee, South Korea's controversial historic leader, who conducted a coup and became president through a military dictatorship in 1993. Once the United States officially recognized his administration, Park believed that for South Korea to become a great nation, it required a robust economy. General Park Chung-hee wheedled, coaxed, intimidated, manipulated, and outright threatened the companies for cooperation. But the president also offered incentives, government and foreign loans, relaxed regulations, and tax cuts. The Chaebols founded the Federation of Korean Industries in 1963 to promote their interests and support Park's efforts. Even before Park's dictatorship seized power, Samsung and LG were already thriving, with both firms ranking among the top 10 in South Korea. However, the two companies did not always embrace the government's initiatives. For example, Lee Byung-chull, the founder of Samsung, and Park despised each other. Lee, who was older than Park, described Park as an upstart, illiterate thug. President Park, on the other hand, thought of Lee as a man born with a silver spoon in his mouth. These families were able to extend their commercial empires into new sectors, with little concern of international competition or costly failures because the government offered protection and cracked down on the labor movement. Samsung is only one of a handful of family-controlled companies that dominate economic life in South Korea. Others include Hyundai, Hyundai, LG, Kun-hee, Lotte, and SK Group. Chaebol are large groups of interconnected companies that are usually dominated by a wealthy family. LG, for example, makes smartphones, televisions, electronic components, chemicals, and fertilizer. It also owns Korean baseball and basketball teams. Hyundai, which makes the Hyundai and Kia cars that are popular in the United States and other countries, also makes elevators, provides logistics services, and runs hotels and department stores. According to the World Trade Organization, Chaebol grew into huge corporations with a roughly two-thirds market share in South Korean manufacturing by the end of the 1990s. Money intended for the common people frequently ended up in the hands of wealthy families, causing resentment that still exists today. Many South Koreans hold the belief that their enormous wealth was amassed at the expense of the general public. Repeated Chaebol scandals irritate people most. For example, one of the most controversial cases involving Chaebols came to be known as the Nut Rage Incident. Cho Hyun-ah, the daughter of the chairman of Korean Air, threw a tantrum that landed her in jail over how macadamia nuts had been served to her in first class. This made the company a target of ridicule and outrage in South Korea and elsewhere. Cho Hyun-ah used abusive language, tossed documents, and even forced flight attendants to kneel and beg for forgiveness for serving the nuts without her permission and in an unopened packet rather than on a plate. Miss Cho was still not pleased. So while the Korean Air jet was taxiing at New York's Kennedy International Airport, she ordered for it to be returned to the gate so she could have the senior flight attendant removed. In another crazy incident, Tae-woo, the chairman of South Korea's third-largest Chaebol, was charged with embezzlement. SK Group is the world's second biggest memory chips maker, which also owns the country's biggest telco, SK Telecom, alongside other businesses in petrochemical and construction. On the 70th anniversary of the end of Japanese colonial authority over Korea, Tae-woo was freed from prison, along with hundreds of others, thanks to a contentious presidential pardon. The 54-year-old has already completed 31 months of his 48-month sentence for embezzling approximately $59 million in 2008. It was the second time he had been granted a pardon. He was sentenced to 3 years in jail in 2003 for his participation in an accounting conspiracy involving $1.3 billion. He was released after only 7 months on that occasion. In 2007, he infamously exacted revenge for his son's bar fight by clobbering the establishment's employees with a metal pipe as his bodyguards watched. His prison term was suspended in all 3 cases. However, Seung-yeon was sentenced to 4 years in jail in the most recent embezzlement case. Currently, he is on probation. If you haven't already observed a pattern, most of these people manage to walk scot-free for cases that would land anyone else behind bars for decades. Corruption is wildly prevalent in the South Korean society, and money can literally do wonders. The most obvious example of the Korean attraction to Chaebols is a culture of aspiring to work for them. Working for a Chaebol exudes an almost unrivaled sense of accomplishment and security. The more powerful the Chaebol, the more prestigious it is to work for it. Samsung's admission exam is remarkably popular, with 100,000 test takers in 2011 and 200,000 by 2014, despite the fact that only 1 in 10 will be hired that year. This increased competition for Samsung reflects a wider issue in Korea right now: rising youth unemployment. The issue of nepotism in Chaebols is well known. Most Chaebols pass down leadership via the family, and it is not unusual for scarce entry-level positions to be filled by relatives of present employees. So what is the future of Chaebols? The truth is Chaebols are under threat. Following such scandals, the current president, Moon Jae-in, made a key electoral pledge to rein in the Chaebols and fight down on corruption. Because of broad popular resistance to their political clout, the Chaebols' influence on society had already begun to decline in prior years. So despite substantial evidence of criminal misbehavior, little has changed in the 3 years since President Moon entered office, as seen by yet another Samsung controversy, in which courts declined to issue an arrest warrant for Samsung's de facto leader, Lee Jae-yong. So what does this mean for Chaebols? Do you think the grip they have on the South Korean economy will decrease? Let us know in the comments. We are always looking for your interesting takes. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video. To see why the World Bank is a scam, click here. And to know more about how drug money saved banks in 2008, click here. That's all we have for you today. Thanks for watching.